84-year-old Robert Chen moved slowly through Denver International Airport security checkpoint, his weathered hands gripping a small leather briefcase that had traveled with him for over 60 years. When the metal detector beeped, TSA agent Derek Morrison, 23 years old and 6 months into his first real job, sighed with visible impatience. "Sir, please empty all metal objects from your pockets," Morrison said, his tone suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. Robert nodded politely and reached into his jacket pocket, withdrawing a small wooden box about the size of a paperback book. The box was worn smooth by decades of careful handling, its brass hinges tarnished with age. "What's in the box?" Morrison asked. "Medals," Robert replied quietly, his English still touched by the accent of his childhood in a Chinese immigrant family in San Francisco. Morrison opened the box and his expression immediately shifted to one of dismissive annoyance. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were 6 military decorations. Even to Morrison's untrained eye, they looked old and well-worn. "These aren't real," Morrison announced loudly enough for other passengers to hear. "Costume jewelry. You can't bring fake military medals through security." Several passengers in line turned to look. A few chuckled. Robert's face remained impassive, but his eyes, still sharp despite his age, showed a flicker of pain. "They are real," Robert said quietly. "Right." Morrison picked up the medals one by one, examining them with the authority of someone who'd watched too many military movies. Purple Heart, Bronze Star, Silver Star. He paused at the largest medal, a 5-pointed star hanging from a light blue ribbon with 13 white stars. "And this one's supposed to be what? The Medal of Honor?" "Give me a break, old man." "It is the Medal of Honor," Robert said, his voice still calm, but with an edge that anyone who'd served would have recognized immediately. Morrison laughed and shook his head. "Sure it is. And I'm General Patton." He began dropping the medals into a plastic bin marked confiscated items, essentially the trash. "These fake medals are disrespectful to real veterans. I'm confiscating them." Robert watched his medals, each one earned with blood, courage, and sacrifice, clatter into the bin like discarded costume jewelry. For a moment, something dangerous flickered in his eyes. But he was 84 years old in a crowded airport, surrounded by TSA agents and police. So he said nothing. What Derek Morrison didn't know was that he had just thrown away decorations earned during some of the most vicious fighting of the Korean War. What he definitely didn't know was that only 473 people had ever received the Medal of Honor for actions during that conflict. And he absolutely didn't know that Captain James Wright, sitting in the airport restaurant 30 feet away, was one of the foremost experts on military decorations in the United States Air Force. Wright, a decorated pilot with over 30 years of service, had been nursing a coffee while waiting for his delayed flight when he heard the commotion. As a member of the Air Force's Military Awards Review Board, he'd seen thousands of military decorations over his career. He could spot a fake from across a room. He could also spot the real thing. Wright stood up and walked toward the security checkpoint, his pilot's uniform giving him the authority to approach the scene. What he saw in that plastic bin made his blood run cold. "Excuse me," Wright said to Morrison, pulling out his military ID. "Captain James Wright, United States Air Force. May I ask what's happening here?" Morrison, suddenly faced with an actual military officer, straightened up. "Sir, this gentleman tried to bring fake military medals through security. I confiscated them for being disrespectful to real veterans." Wright looked at Robert, seeing the quiet dignity of a man who'd been through this kind of disrespect before. Then he looked at the medals in the bin. Even from a distance, he could see details that no fake could replicate. The specific ribbon colors, the precise engraving, the patina that only came from decades of careful preservation. "May I examine those medals?" Wright asked. Morrison hesitated, then handed over the bin. Wright carefully lifted out the Medal of Honor, examining it with the practiced eye of an expert. The weight was right. The craftsmanship was perfect. The serial number was exactly where it should be. More importantly, Wright recognized the name engraved on the back. Robert Chen, Captain, U.S. Army, 1952. Wright's hands began to shake slightly. He'd read about Captain Robert Chen in military history books. The Chinese-American officer who'd held Hill 255 against overwhelming odds. The man who'd single-handedly saved an entire battalion from annihilation. "Sir," Wright said to Robert, his voice filled with respect, "are you Captain Robert Chen, 7th Infantry Division, Korea?" Robert nodded quietly. Wright immediately came to attention and saluted. Around them, the busy airport seemed to pause as other passengers noticed a uniformed officer saluting an elderly man in civilian clothes. "Agent Morrison," Wright said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his rank. "You have just confiscated the Medal of Honor belonging to one of the greatest heroes in American military history. I suggest you return those medals immediately and apologize." Morrison's face went white. Around them, passengers were beginning to understand what was happening. Someone started recording with their phone. I didn't know," Morrison stammered. "You didn't bother to find out," Wright replied coldly. "These medals represent actions that saved the lives of over 400 American soldiers." Captain Chen held a strategic position for 72 hours against 6 separate enemy assaults, calling in artillery strikes on his own position to stop the enemy advance. Wright carefully placed the medals back in their box and handed them to Robert. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you. I've read about your actions at Chosin Reservoir. Every Air Force cadet studies your tactical decisions." Robert accepted his medals with quiet dignity. "Thank you, Captain. It was a long time ago." But the damage had been done. In the age of social media, someone's video of a TSA agent throwing a Medal of Honor into the trash was already spreading across the internet. Within minutes, it had been shared hundreds of times. Morrison's supervisor, alerted by the commotion, arrived to find his agent in the middle of a public relations disaster. Security cameras had captured everything. A decorated Air Force captain was demanding to speak with airport management, and an elderly Medal of Honor recipient was standing quietly while chaos erupted around him. "Mr. Chen," the supervisor said, "I am deeply sorry for this misunderstanding. We'll launch a full investigation." "No investigation needed," Robert said quietly. "Young man was doing his job as he understood it. Perhaps better training would help." His grace in the face of such disrespect only made the situation worse for TSA. Here was a genuine American hero showing more class than the agency that was supposed to protect travelers. Captain Wright wasn't nearly as forgiving. This is exactly the kind of ignorance that disrespects our veterans every day. How many other decorated soldiers have been humiliated at this checkpoint? Word was spreading through the airport. Other military personnel, both active duty and veterans, began gathering around the security checkpoint. Flight crews, passengers, airport employees, anyone with military experience was drawn to the scene. Among them was Colonel Patricia Hayes, the same officer who had been involved in the Sarah Mitchell case months earlier. She was traveling to Washington for congressional hearings and happened to be flying through Denver. "Captain Wright," she called out, recognizing him from various military conferences. "What's the situation here?" Wright quickly explained what had happened. Hayes' expression grew darker with each detail. "Captain Chen," she said, approaching Robert with the respect due a senior hero. "I'm Colonel Hayes, U.S. Army. I want to personally apologize for how you've been treated." "Colonel, this is Robert Chen," Wright said. "Medal of Honor, Korea. Hill 255 inches. Hayes' eyes widened. She'd not only read about Hill 255, she'd used it as a case study when she taught at the War College. Robert Chen wasn't just a Medal of Honor recipient. He was a legend. "Sir," she said, saluting crisply. "You are a living piece of American military history. The defense of Hill 255 is still taught at West Point." Around them, the crowd was growing. Airport security was trying to manage what was rapidly becoming a media event. TSA supervisors were making frantic phone calls, and somewhere in the airport, a young agent named Derek Morrison was learning that some mistakes follow you for the rest of your career. But for Robert Chen, this was just another day in a life that had seen too much disrespect for too many years. He'd grown used to being invisible, to having his service questioned, to being dismissed as just another old man with stories nobody wanted to hear. What he wasn't prepared for was what happened next. Captain Wright pulled out his phone and made a call. "This is Captain Wright, Air Force personnel. I need you to contact the Veterans Affairs Office and the Air Force Public Affairs immediately. We have a situation at Denver International involving a Medal of Honor recipient." Within minutes, Wright's phone was ringing constantly. News outlets, military organizations, veteran groups. Word was spreading faster than anyone could have imagined. The video of Morrison throwing the medals in the trash had gone viral. "Respect your veterans" was trending, and suddenly everyone wanted to know more about the quiet old man who'd been so gracefully humiliated at airport security. Robert just wanted to catch his flight to Los Angeles to visit his granddaughter. Instead, he found himself at the center of a national conversation about how America treats its heroes. And this was only the beginning. Within 2 hours of the incident, Denver International Airport was in crisis mode. The video had been viewed over 100,000 times and shared by major news outlets. The hashtag #Medal of Honor disrespected was trending nationally, and every veteran organization in the country was demanding answers. Airport Director Maria Santos found herself in an emergency meeting with TSA leadership, public relations specialists, and increasingly frantic phone calls from Washington, D.C. "How the hell does this happen?" Santos demanded, watching the viral video for the 10th time. "How does a TSA agent not recognize a Medal of Honor?" "Agent Morrison has been suspended pending investigation," TSA Supervisor John Blake replied. "But ma'am, in his defense, we see a lot of fake military items. People try to bring replica medals through security all the time. Did he verify anything? Check for documentation? Ask any questions beyond assuming they were fake?" Blake's silence was answer enough. Meanwhile, Robert Chen sat in the airport's VIP lounge, where he'd been escorted after Colonel Hayes made it clear that leaving a Medal of Honor recipient standing in a security checkpoint was unacceptable. He seemed uncomfortable with the attention, occasionally checking his watch and mentioning his flight to Los Angeles. "Sir," Captain Wright said, sitting beside him, "I hope you understand the significance of what happened today. This isn't just about one TSA agent. This is about how we treat our veterans." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "I have experienced worse treatment than this, Captain. During the war, after the war. This is not unusual." That comment hit Wright like a physical blow. The idea that Medal of Honor recipients regularly face disrespect was almost incomprehensible to him. "Would you be willing to tell me about it?" Wright asked. "About your service, about what you've experienced since?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "I have not spoken much about Korea. People are not often interested in old wars." "I'm interested, sir. Very interested." So Robert began to tell his story, and Wright realized he was hearing firsthand accounts of events that had been classified for decades. Robert Chen had been 22 years old when he arrived in Korea as a second lieutenant with the 7th Infantry Division. The son of Chinese immigrants, he'd faced discrimination throughout his military career, soldiers questioning his loyalty, officers assuming he was a security risk because of his ethnicity. "They called us gooks sometimes," Robert said matter-of-factly. "Did not matter that we were American soldiers. We looked like the enemy to some people." But Robert's tactical brilliance and personal courage had quickly earned respect from the men under his command. By the time the Chinese entered the war in massive numbers, he was a captain commanding a critical hilltop position near the Chosin Reservoir. Hill 255 was not much to look at, Robert continued. Rock and frozen dirt. But it controlled the valley. If the Chinese took it, they could attack our supply lines, cut off 3 battalions. On November 28, 1951, Chinese forces launched a massive assault designed to overrun Hill 255 and break the American defensive line. Robert's company of 127 men faced an estimated 2,000 enemy soldiers in wave after wave of attacks. First attack came at dawn. We held. Second attack at noon. We held. But we were running out of ammunition, medical supplies. Men were dying. Captain Wright listened, mesmerized. He'd read the official reports, but hearing it from Robert himself was like experiencing history. By the third day, we had maybe 40 men left who could still fight. Chinese were bringing up artillery, mortars. They were going to shell us off that hill. That's when Robert made the decision that would earn him the Medal of Honor and haunt him for the rest of his life. I called in artillery strike on my own position, told them to shell Hill 255 with everything they had. Only way to stop the Chinese advance. Wright's eyes widened. Calling artillery on your own position was the most desperate tactical decision a commander could make. It meant accepting that your own men would die to complete the mission. How many casualties? Wright asked quietly. 17 more of my men died in our own artillery strike. But it worked. Chinese could not advance through the barrage. We held the hill. Robert's voice remained steady, but Wright could see the weight of those decisions in his eyes. 17 men under his command, killed by American artillery on his orders. Sir, those men died to save thousands of others. Without Hill 255 - I know the mathematics, Captain. Does not make it easier to live with. The conversation was interrupted by Colonel Hayes, who approached with her phone in hand and a grim expression. Gentlemen, we have a problem. The video has reached international news. CNN, Fox, BBC, everyone's covering this story. And there's more. She showed them her phone screen. The original video now had over 500,000 views, but more concerning were the dozens of response videos being posted by other veterans sharing their own stories of disrespect at airports, government offices, and public places. This is becoming bigger than just one incident, Hayes said. People are using this as a symbol of how America treats its veterans. Airport Director Santos approached their table, looking harried and exhausted. Mr. Chen, I want to personally apologize again for what happened. We're implementing immediate changes to our training protocols. Ms. Santos, Robert interrupted politely, I appreciate your concern, but I would like to catch my flight to Los Angeles. My granddaughter is expecting me. Sir, with respect, I don't think you understand the scope of this situation. The Secretary of Transportation is flying in from Washington to meet with you personally. The President's office has called twice. This has become a national incident. Robert looked genuinely puzzled. Because a young man made a mistake? This seems excessive. Wright realized that Robert truly didn't grasp the symbolic power of what had happened. To him, it was just another instance of routine disrespect he'd endured for decades. To the rest of America, it was a crystallizing moment that revealed how the country treated its heroes. Sir, Wright said gently, when was the last time you wore your Medal of Honor in public? Robert thought for a moment. 1953, the ceremony at the White House when President Eisenhower presented it. You've never worn it since? Where would I wear it? To the grocery store. People would think I was pretending to be something I am not. Robert's smile was sad. Better to keep it private. That comment was overheard by a reporter who'd managed to get into the VIP lounge, and within minutes it was being quoted across social media. The image of a Medal of Honor recipient hiding his decoration for 70 years because people wouldn't believe it was real, struck a nerve with millions of Americans. The story was no longer about TSA procedures or airport security. It had become about national honor, respect for service, and how America treated its greatest heroes. And Robert Chen, who just wanted to visit his granddaughter, found himself at the center of a movement he'd never asked to lead. But the most surprising development was yet to come. At 4:17 p.m., exactly 6 hours after the original incident, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to Denver International Airport. Out stepped Secretary of Transportation James Morrison, no relation to the TSA agent, Secretary of Veterans Affairs Patricia Williams, and a full complement of federal officials. They weren't coming just to apologize. They were coming to offer Robert Chen something no Medal of Honor recipient had ever received: a formal federal apology for decades of systemic disrespect, and a promise that things would change. Whether Robert wanted it or not, his quiet dignity in the face of humiliation was about to transform how America honored its veterans. The 84-year-old man who'd survived Chinese human wave attacks was about to face something much more challenging: becoming a national symbol. The scene in Denver International Airport's main terminal had transformed into something resembling a state ceremony. Federal officials, military leaders, veteran organization representatives, and media from around the world had converged on what should have been a simple travel day for Robert Chen. The elderly Medal of Honor recipient sat quietly in the VIP lounge, still wearing the same simple sweater and slacks he'd started his journey in, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the chaos swirling around him. Secretary of Transportation James Morrison, who had spent the flight from Washington dealing with the irony of sharing a name with the TSA agent who'd caused this crisis, approached Robert with the gravity of someone delivering a state apology. "Mr. Chen," Morrison began, "I want to personally apologize not just for today's incident, but for the systemic failures that made it possible. This should never have happened to any veteran, much less to someone with your extraordinary record of service." Robert nodded politely. "Secretary Morrison, I appreciate your words, but I do not require an apology. The young man was doing his job as he understood it." The grace of Robert's response, captured by news cameras, would later be cited as an example of the dignity that made him worthy of the Medal of Honor in the first place. Secretary of Veterans Affairs Patricia Williams stepped forward next. "Sir, with your permission, we'd like to share your story with the American people. Not just what happened today, but your service record. Most Americans have never heard of Hill 255 or the defense of the Chosin Reservoir. They should know what you did for this country." Robert shifted uncomfortably. "I did what any soldier would do. My actions were not special." Captain Wright, who had remained close to Robert throughout the afternoon, couldn't stay silent. "Sir, with respect, that's exactly why this story matters. You've spent 70 years believing that incredible courage and sacrifice were just doing your job, but they weren't ordinary at all." By now, the story had evolved far beyond the original TSA incident. Military historians were being interviewed about the strategic importance of Hill 255. Korean War veterans were sharing their own stories of Robert's legendary status among soldiers who'd served in that conflict. Social media was flooded with posts from active duty military expressing their respect for Captain Chen. But perhaps the most powerful development was happening outside the airport. Hundreds of veterans had begun gathering in the parking lot and terminal, some driving for hours after seeing the news coverage. They came in old VFW jackets, motorcycle vests, dress uniforms, and civilian clothes. Vietnam veterans, Iraq veterans, Afghanistan veterans, and other Korean War survivors who remembered the stories of Hill 255. Colonel Hayes, coordinating with airport security to manage the growing crowd, realized they were witnessing something unprecedented: a spontaneous gathering of veterans united by respect for one of their own. "Mr. Chen," she said, "there are people outside who would like to meet you. Veterans who've traveled here just to shake your hand." Robert looked confused. "Why would they want to meet me?" "Because you're a hero, sir, and heroes are rare." Airport Director Santos had been fielding calls all afternoon, from the White House, Pentagon, Congress, and major news networks. The incident had become a defining moment in discussions about veteran treatment, airport security procedures, and national respect for military service. "Mr. Chen," Santos said, "we'd like to create a permanent memorial here at the airport, a display about your service and the importance of respecting our veterans. Would you approve of that?" Robert considered this. If it helps other veterans be treated with respect, then yes. Meanwhile, TSA agent Derek Morrison was having the worst day of his professional life. Suspended pending investigation, he'd watched in horror as his mistake became a national symbol of disrespect for veterans. What had started as routine security screening had ended his career in federal law enforcement. But Morrison had also been learning about the man whose medals he'd thrown away. Reading about Hill 255, about Robert's tactical brilliance, about the 400 soldiers whose lives had been saved by one captain's decision to call artillery on his own position. Morrison appeared at the VIP lounge entrance, escorted by his supervisor and looking like a man who'd aged years in a single day. "Mr. Chen," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I know I have no right to ask, but could I speak with you privately?" Robert looked at the young man, barely older than the soldiers he'd commanded in Korea, and nodded. They stepped aside, away from the officials and cameras. "Sir, I want to apologize," Morrison began. "Not because my supervisors told me to, but because I realize I disrespected something sacred. I threw away medals that represented— I don't even know how to describe what they represented." Robert studied the young man's face. "You made a mistake. People make mistakes. But this wasn't just any mistake. I humiliated a genuine American hero because I was too lazy and ignorant to recognize real valor when I saw it." Morrison's voice cracked. "I've been reading about what you did in Korea. How are you not angry with me?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. "In Korea, I learned that anger is useful only when it helps you accomplish your mission. My mission now is not to punish young men for their mistakes, but to help them understand why those mistakes matter." Morrison nodded, tears visible in his eyes. "I'll never work in security again. I'll never have the chance to make this right." "Perhaps," Robert said gently, "you will find other ways to honor the service of veterans. Better ways." The conversation was interrupted by commotion in the main terminal. The gathered veterans had begun something that would later be described as one of the most moving displays of military respect ever captured on camera. Led by a group of Korean War veterans who had served in the same sector as Robert, hundreds of former servicemen and women had formed an honor guard stretching from the security checkpoint to the departure gates. They stood at attention in whatever uniform or veteran attire they had, creating a corridor of respect for the man who had epitomized military honor for 7 decades. "Mr. Chen," Colonel Hayes said, "they're waiting for you." Robert walked slowly through the honor guard, stopping to shake hands with veterans, accepting salutes from active duty personnel, and acknowledging the respect of people who understood the true meaning of sacrifice. At the end of the corridor waited his gate, where his delayed flight to Los Angeles was finally ready for boarding. But the pilot, Captain Sarah Mitchell, the former Navy SEAL who had recently returned from her own ordeal, had a surprise. "Mr. Chen," Captain Mitchell said, "it would be an honor to have you in the cockpit during takeoff. If you'd like to see how far aviation has come since your service days." Robert smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. "I would like that very much." As Robert boarded the aircraft to the applause of passengers and crew, the ripple effects of his dignified response to disrespect were already spreading across the country. TSA announced immediate changes to training protocols, including mandatory education about military decorations and veteran recognition. The Denver Airport Memorial to Veteran Service would be completed within 6 months. Derek Morrison would leave federal service, but would spend the next decade working with veteran organizations, becoming one of the most effective advocates for military appreciation in civilian settings. Most importantly, Robert Chen's story sparked a national conversation about the invisible veterans among us, the heroes who had returned from war to quiet civilian lives, carrying their medals in small boxes, rather than wearing them with pride. 6 months later, Robert would attend a ceremony at the White House, where President Harrison would present him with the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his lifetime of service and dignity in the face of adversity. But for now, he just wanted to reach Los Angeles in time for his granddaughter's piano recital. As Captain Mitchell guided the aircraft into the Colorado sky, Robert sat in the co-pilot's seat, looking down at the landscape he'd defended with his life 70 years earlier. "Beautiful country," Captain Mitchell commented. "Yes," Robert agreed quietly. "Worth protecting." Behind them, in the passenger cabin, the story was already being shared with the world. Videos of the Honor Guard, interviews with the veterans who had gathered, and discussions about the broader meaning of respect for military service. But Robert Chen, Medal of Honor recipient, Korean war hero, and reluctant symbol of veteran dignity, was focused on what had always mattered most to him: family, duty, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had served his country well. The TSA incident would be remembered as a turning point in how America treated its veterans. But for Robert, it was just another day in a life dedicated to something larger than himself. Some heroes, after all, are made not just by their actions in war, but by their grace in peace. The Robert Chen Memorial Terminal at Denver International Airport bustled with the usual activity of travelers, but now it carried an additional sense of purpose. The permanent display honoring Medal of Honor recipients had become one of the most visited exhibits in any American airport. Robert stood before the display case containing a replica of his medals, reading the plaque that told the story of Hill 255 to thousands of passengers every day. At 85, he moved more slowly than he had a year ago, but his eyes remained sharp and alert. "Grandfather, are you ready?" asked his granddaughter Lisa, now 16, and proudly wearing a military academy sweatshirt. The events of the previous year had sparked her interest in military service, much to her family's mixture of pride and concern. "Almost," Robert replied, adjusting the Medal of Honor he now wore openly on special occasions. Today was the first anniversary of what the media had dubbed the Denver incident, and he'd been invited to speak at the commemoration ceremony. Derek Morrison approached hesitantly, wearing a Veterans Affairs volunteer badge. Over the past year, he'd become one of the most knowledgeable advocates for veteran services in Colorado, driven by his determination to make amends for his mistake. "Mr. Chen," Morrison said, "the ceremony is about to begin. They're ready for you." Robert nodded and walked toward the designated area where hundreds of people had gathered: veterans, military families, airport employees, and travelers who changed their flight plans just to attend. As he took the podium, Robert looked out at faces representing every branch of military service and every generation of veterans. The crowd included congressional representatives, Pentagon officials, and veteran organization leaders, but also ordinary citizens who'd been moved by the story of dignity in the face of disrespect. "1 year ago," Robert began, his voice carrying clearly through the terminal, "a young man made a mistake. He treated my military decorations as worthless costume jewelry. But that mistake became something larger, a reminder that respect must be earned daily, not assumed." He paused, looking at Derek Morrison in the crowd. That young man has since become one of our most effective advocates for veteran recognition. His mistake taught all of us that redemption is possible when we commit ourselves to serving something greater than our own interests. The speech was brief, focusing not on the disrespect he'd experienced, but on the positive changes that had resulted. New TSA training programs, increased veteran recognition efforts, and a national conversation about honoring military service. But the most significant change was visible in Robert himself. For the first time in 70 years, he wore his Medal of Honor with pride, no longer hiding his service, but using it to advocate for other veterans who remained invisible. After the ceremony, as Robert prepared to return to Los Angeles, Captain Sarah Mitchell approached. She was now working with the Veterans Administration to help former military personnel transition to civilian aviation careers. "Mr. Chen," she said, "I wanted to thank you. Your example helped me realize that hiding from our service doesn't protect us. It wastes the experiences that could help others." Robert smiled. "We all serve in different ways, Captain. The uniform changes, but the duty continues." As his flight prepared for departure, Robert reflected on the unexpected journey that had begun with a TSA agent's mistake. What had started as routine disrespect had become a national moment of reflection on how America treated its heroes. But more importantly, it had reminded Robert that his service hadn't ended in Korea. Every day he chose dignity over anger, understanding over resentment, and hope over bitterness was another form of service to the country he'd pledged to protect. The plane lifted off into the Colorado sky, carrying a Medal of Honor recipient who was no longer hiding his light under a bushel, but letting it shine for all the veterans who followed in his footsteps. In the terminal below, Derek Morrison continued his volunteer work, helping veterans navigate the complex systems designed to serve them. His mistake had ended one career, but had begun another, more meaningful one. And in airports across the country, TSA agents who had received new training in military recognition continued their duties with a deeper understanding of the heroes who might pass through their checkpoints. Some mistakes, after all, become the foundation for something better.